Welcome everybody. This really started as a summary of a few trips I'd made, but going back a little bit, I started as a contester very early on in ham radio, and fell in with a bad crowd, guys like N6TR and N6TV and guys like that. And of course, we got into sweepstakes and CD parties when they had them back then, and some DX contests. But of course, the DX contests, you're just another six, and you're wondering, gee, what would it be like on the other end of the pileup? So eventually, I got the opportunity to do that. So we're going to talk a little bit about, kind of what it takes going into these things, and just some stories, and not a lot of pictures in the first few years, but just some stories about things we encountered, things we found out was we were as we were making these trips. So here's where I've done CQ worldwide so far. We got 24 countries, 22 zones, and lots of fun, and stories that would last for days. So we'll start with a few of them. So as you can see, it's pretty well spread across the globe. There are certainly areas like in the Russian area that I haven't been to yet, but one of these days when conditions are a little different, hopefully we can do that. All right. Here's a tabulation of these things. Everything that says November is CW. Everything that says October is phone. And we've had, we don't go in order to beat the world, but a couple of times we've managed to do that. 3 times we've taken top, in the case of FY0GA multi-single, and KP2N and Charlie 5 Zulu multi-multi. And we've had a number of continental number ones. We've had a couple where we were named CQ's D-Expedition of the Year. So, but whether we get an award or not, the purpose is really to go and have fun and meet the people and experience propagation from that part of the world. And so we've had a chance to do an awful lot of that. Anytime you're going to go on a trip like this, there's a number of things you need to do in advance. First, of course, if there are local operators, you don't want to just barge in there and set up in their face. You really want to coordinate with the locals, invite them to participate, and get their assistance. Make sure that all your operators are appropriately licensed. In the case of the CEPT countries, like in Europe, that's pretty easy because you just show your license and you have a copy of the CEPT agreement. In other parts, you have to actually apply for a separate license, and you send in either some or a lot of documentation, and you'll have to arrange for customs clearance for your equipment. And in some cases, there are restrictions on what you can bring in. We'll talk about that later. Make sure you know what the power sources are and that your equipment runs off the appropriate voltage. Have your adapters ready. You have to deal with airline weight limits. Ideally, you'd like to pack up your whole station, a couple towers, and load it all up, but you can't really do that if this is a fly-in. Now, there are people that do expeditions for contests and otherwise, where they're chartering an icebreaker, or they're sailing across the South Atlantic for a week or something like that. We don't do that. This is all fly-in or fly-in drive, and so the normal baggage limits apply. You'll need some tools and repair parts, cables and accessories and so on. Just like in field day, you think about kind of the whole station concept, from the microphone and paddle input all the way to the antenna and everything in between. So you try to make sure you don't forget any chunks of that. To help with that, I have I've made up some spreadsheets, and with weights and so on, so I can figure out what we're taking, what's it going to weigh, and which case should it go in. If you saw my presentation on prepare for the worst operating from the Gambia, which is on RATPAC YouTube, you will see a detail of that chart and how I worked everything out. You need to be prepared to climb in some cases, whether it's trees or whatever, and work in the local climate. Sometimes that's easy, sometimes that's a little more challenging. So here we go. We'll start with KH6XX. Those of you who are old timers, you may remember Randy being active in many of the contests. He was a reliable contact on most of the bands. Uh, he had a place on the north shore of Oahu, right up here. Uh, you've got town of Haleiwa, which is known for surfer hangouts and art galleries, and then you've got the Polynesian Cultural Center over here. We're kind of right here, about a couple of miles up into the hills, and it's a great piece of property. Here's the aerial view. This is the strip right here. And you can see these little cross mark things. These are Yagis. 2, 3, 4. There are actually six towers on this property. And you'll see another view of those a little later. This was a pole house. So, basically you go upstairs and it had a living room, a kitchen, and a bed, I think a bedroom and a living room. So Aunt Randy had amplifiers in the closets, and we brought our Drake lines. This was a 2 single op efforts. I went single band 10 meters, and Neil AE6E, now W4EA, did single band 15. This was on CW. So we basically ran the full, as much of the contest as we could. Fortunately, 10 meters gives you a little time to sleep at night. But the bands were very hot, and I found, of course, that my CW speed by the end of the contest was about 8 words a minute faster than it was at the beginning. You just keep building and going, and you get the energy, and pretty soon, I had the memory key. I didn't want to wait to push the button. I just grabbed the paddle and went. So that was a blast. But it did give me the first chance to experience propagation from outside the continental United States. Next one was a little closer. XE2SI is the call for the Tijuana Radio Club. And a number of us from the Southern Cal Contest Club and some of the folks from San Diego contesters, we decided we wanted to operate from Zone 6, Mexico. Zone 6 is actually fairly rare, especially on CW in the worldwide contest. There are times when you don't work any Zone 6. So we wanted to activate Mexico, and the folks at the Tijuana Club were very helpful, just extremely helpful. Actually, they arranged for a location for us. The location was on a Mexican Army military base just south of the border, and specifically, it was on a hilltop on that base. The hilltop was where they had their water tank that supplied the entire base. And so what they arranged was that they would fill the water tank during the days before our arrival, and then we got to unplug their pumps, and I'll take all that 220 power and distribute it among our stations. That's pretty hospitable. And so I made up a big AC distribution board with cables so that we could spread the power around to all the stations. But the adventure really started as we were heading down there. Wayne Overbeck, N6NB, and I and several others had built tower trailers, where you've got I don't know if you'll see a picture of them. Well, you see it up, but basically these things ride about 6 feet off the ground parallel, and then you crank them up this way when you're ready to operate and put out the outriggers. But we had this parade of heavy looking machinery. This all occurred just after the U.S. had invaded Grenada. So we were afraid that they would think this was the second invasion because it kind of looked military and artillery type stuff. But there was no problem. You get your insurance, and we went up there, and it worked out very well. Here's one of those tower trailers you see. This was I think Wayne's 70 footer with a 2-element 40 on it. We had monoband beams for 10 through 40, wires for 80 and 160. There's a very young Glenn Ratman, W6MAR back then, now K6NA, and Dave Hodge, A6RX, and the late Phil Getz, N6ZZ. And we had several others from the contest club there. One of the interesting things was I realized that, hearing on 160 is always a bit of a problem. Those of you that work the low bands know that. And I noticed there was this big barbed wire fence that went on and on for a long distance. And I thought, I brought a beverage cup, a beverage transformer. I said, why don't we just cut one of these wires and use it as a feed for a beverage, use the top wire for a beverage. So we did. And I handed ran the received coax into the 160 station. And the next morning they said, well, I said, well, how did it work? He said, all we could hear was a bunch of mobiles in Des Moines, Iowa. Well, I hadn't really realized how far that fence went. And of course, if you look at the pattern on a beverage antenna, if it's, miles long, it's going to have an extremely narrow pattern. So he was picking up all the mobiles chatting with each other Monday morning in this one narrow razor blade strip and nothing else. So we learned something from that experience, but it was kind of humorous. The other thing I remember distinctly about this is that Phil, who is well known as a multitasker, he was sitting there in a tent running stations on 15 CW, and I was in, and Phil was. This is before computer logging and all that. So he's a lefty, so he was logging with his left hand on the pencil and paper, sending with the right hand, and he stopped and had a conversation with me at the same time, doing all this at once. Very few people can do that. Next one was a little further. It's my first foray into South America, and that was FY0GA, French Guiana. Our host was FY5YE Mario, and they said, well, we have a 4-bedroom beach house in Cayenne, and you can use that. Well, it turned out to be 4 beds in 1 room. My wife had come along, so that was a little cozy. But and it wasn't really a beach. French Guiana has a tide very much like the Bay of Fundy, where at high tide the water's lapping up against your building, and at low tide it's so far out, it's miles out, you can't see it, and it's just mud flats. If you ever saw the movie Papillon, that you'll see what that they're talking about there. So we did a multi-single there. So basically we had a 1-run station, and that was Don Jones and myself running the pileups on CW. And then we had all the locals and some others who were picking off multipliers on the other bands. Now, I don't like multi-single because it means, you can only work new multipliers. So you work one US guy on 160, all the others want to work you, and you can't work them unless you turn off your run station. And that seems to me a waste of good radio capability, but that's what it was. We had a vertical for the low bands, but you need a good ground for those things. So what we did was we got a bunch of aluminum foil, and we strapped it to the bottom of the vertical, the ground portion, and we ran it out into the water on these mud flats, put rocks on it, and so the salt water kind of kept it damp, and that was enough to get us a pretty decent signal on those bands. Meanwhile, my wife went shopping with Mario's wife, and went into the markets, the interior markets there, where they have the catch of the day, whatever they get in the trap. Could be eating capybara or who knows what. And she didn't speak any English. My wife didn't speak any French, but they got along just fine. It was, of course, it's very tropical. It was very hot. And at one point, we had to put mosquito coils under, because there were no screens on the doors in the living room and so on. So our operating room, which also had the bed and mosquito nets, had mosquito coils going, the little bird smoking things. And my wife finally said, "It's so hot here. I'm going to go sleep in the car." Well, that was a mistake because she came back later looking red as a beet, just cooking in the car, even in the middle of the night. Also, they told us not to go out there because they had scorpions and tarantulas in particular that were about almost a foot across, and a bunch of other nasty things. So, um, very interesting operation. The pileups were wonderful. This is back before the wind test guys had a regular stations in French Guiana, so this was kind of a rarity, and made a lot of people happy getting those contacts out. As we arrived there, uh, that's actually Kauru, I think, over here. That's not that far from the European Space Agency's launch site. But when we arrived, of course, we had a lot of equipment, antennas, and so on, and we were concerned about getting it through all their customs. But and there was this big burly guy at the customs, kind of guarding everything. And Mario looks at us and says, "Don't worry, just follow me." And he waves at the guy, and in we go. Well, Mario used to be the general manager of the Cayenne airport, and he knew this guy quite well. And the guy was studying for his ham license, so it helps to know people. Next, a real adventure, JY7Z in Jordan. We had been very interested in operating from Jordan, obviously pretty rare, and certainly in the contest, it's very rare. But it was hard to get the doors open. So we ended up talking to our good buddy Dave Bell, W6AQ. Those of you who remember Dave know that he made the first whole series of amateur radio promotional films. And the first one was A Ham's Wide World, which featured several of the folks from our contest club, and it featured His Majesty King Hussein of Jordan. Well, Dave and His Majesty became pretty good friends because Dave made several trips over there. In fact, one of the clerks there mentioned, "Mister, I don't know who you are, but you get more time with His Majesty than Henry Kissinger does." So they were very good friends. And when Dave put the word out for us, all of a sudden the doors opened. And so we arranged flights into Amman from Los Angeles and lugged all our equipment. And the King's emissary was there to meet us, walk us through customs with absolutely no questions asked. And we ended up setting up at a sports stadium right in the center of town. And that included antennas that they had taken for some of the Saudi Iraqi neutral zone operations and so on, some of the DX operations, but they didn't have rotators. So we brought a batch of rotators to give to them and leave them and to use during the operation. Again, I think I was the 80-meter guy, and we wanted some beverages. Well, there was this nice long row of hedges going in the right direction. So I just laid a beverage wire on top of those, put a termination on the far end, and that enabled me to hear pretty well going to the US. Europe, we didn't have to worry about. They were plenty loud. So there we were with with the contest running full tilt. And of course, it ends there at like 1 in the morning or something. So we were pretty beat. So, we close up, we hit the sack, and at 7 o'clock in the morning, the phone rings. They say, "Everybody get your coat and tie on. We're going to the palace." Wow. So we hurriedly cleaned up, got down there, and we were ushered in to meet Prince Rod, who was the king's brother. And he kind of very hospitable. And they had the ceremony where this guy comes in full garb, and he has one of these long spouted coffee pots and a little tiny coffee cup. He holds it down here, holds the spout up here, dead pours it right in. He's obviously very good at what he does. And this super strong bitter coffee, and each of us is supposed to take a drink from the same cup. So this is, of course, before COVID, so we didn't have to worry about that. Um, so Terry W6MKB, now K6JL, works at Hewlett Packard, and so he had gotten using his employee discount, had gotten a couple of nice HP calculators, one for Prince Rod and one for His Majesty. Got them engraved and all. So we did that and had a nice visit with him. And they said, "Well, let's go meet His Majesty." So they usher us in. There's a guy with a video camera filming everybody who goes in and out of the king's office. Um, we met with King Hussein for probably half an hour, just talking about whatever, the development of the country and how technology plays into everything, and amateur radio, of course, and just delightful. He was a wonderful guy to talk with, and finally we got a chance to get some pictures out on the patio with him, and he said, "Well, I hope you get to see more of the country before you leave." Well, we excitedly got back to our hotel, and each of us had an envelope waiting for us. And in the envelope was a first class Aliyah airline ticket down to Aqaba on the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba, actually. Uh, so wow. So we were going to go, packing up antennas and stuff. Said, no, no, you're going to go tour. So we ended up going down to Aqaba, and we flew down there, and there were several white Mercedes limos waiting to pick us up, take us off to our first stop, which was Petra. Some of you may have seen either in National Geographic specials or perhaps in one of the Indiana Jones movies. Petra was basically an ancient city on the crossroads of the European, African, and Asian trade routes. And they had these enormous edifices made of carved into sandstone. I think you can see this, like this one right here. This is called the Treasury. This is one of the first things you see when you come out from the coal, that passage. And we had a full day at Petra, including climbing the 900 steps. And we had a guide who was pointing out, you remember so and so in the Bible? There it is. You remember this in the Bible? There it is. You could see Saudi Arabia, you could see Egypt, you could see everything from there. And then, of course, the Gulf of Aqaba itself is crystal clear blue water, and we enjoyed the swim there. After that, we got back, and then we went to the Dead Sea, uh, which separates part of the border between Jordan and Israel. And we got a chance to float in this. That's the saltiest body of water on Earth. And just like this guy here in the picture, we were lying there, hands and feet in the air, and you're just bobbing along like a cork. It was really something. But don't get it in your eyes, because it's really saline and it really stings. And then we went to Jerash, which is an ancient Roman city built on an even more ancient Greek city. So had a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to see a lot of the country. Uh, by the way, Petra, when we saw it, they had not done all the recent ground penetrating radars and so on that they did now. So now they know that below all these edifices are giant water cisterns, and they have a whole water system that had been brought in from many, many miles away. The engineers had figured out the exact 2.5-degree tilt to keep it from flowing at its maximum rate. And this place was pretty much, they could, with that, they could grow their food, they could do everything. And it was this giant trade center and oasis in the middle of the desert. So phenomenal place. If you ever get a chance to visit, I strongly encourage you to do that. Next, closer to home, KP2N. This is the U.S. Virgin Islands, but specifically a place called Water Island, just off St. Thomas. And here we were doing multi-op CW, and we had with us a lot of antennas. We weren't sure, how everything was going to mount, and we weren't sure where everybody was going to operate, but we worked it all out ahead of time. This is one where we had the likes of Vince Thompson, K5VT, now Silent Key, and several other notables. Some of those guys ended up becoming who were called the Voodoods, who used to contest around West Africa. But there we were on Water Island. I was paired with Tony Rogozinski, K7 Bravo Golf, to do 40 meters. And the hotel rooms weren't really suitable for that. So Tony and I operated on a card table out on a driveway under a mosquito net. That was our operating position. Now, during the day before the contest, we had a nice 2-element 40-meter beam, and it turns out not far from us was this old FAA, or it was a VOA tower, I guess, Voice of America or FAA, I'm not sure which, but it was about 125 feet up. So I said, that'd be just a dandy place to put one of our beams, our 40-meter beam in particular. So now this tower had been sitting unmaintained for a long time, and it has all the big metal cross braces, but there were big gaps because it had rusted away. But I figured there was more steel than air on that thing, and I was going to climb it. So I did. I put up a rotator and a 2-element 40-meter beam. Now, while I was up there, I saw this big storm cloud coming, and of course, you get these tropical dusters pretty strong. They just come and they pass you. Well, it hit me just as I was starting to come down. So I got to the bottom, and the left half of me was soaking wet, and the right half of me was basically dry. It just went sideways. Uh, but that beam really worked. I remember specifically sitting in the on the chair in that card table running Europe, and we had lots and lots of Europeans calling us. And at one point, I kept what's called a DX edge, and the DX edge is it's kind of a slide rule that allows you to kind of the predict the sunrise and sunset times. Here's what it. This is kind of a rough picture, but this is kind of what it looks like. You get sliders, one for each month, because of course the sun's pattern is different as the year goes by, and you slide it around to match the UTC, and then you can see what's dark and coming into light, what's light and getting into dark. And so I had this thing with me. I usually take it on all my trips, and I knew that I was going to need zone 29, which is Western Australia out in Perth and so on. That's a pretty fair haul from us. And on the low bands, like 40 meters, it's only going to be open for a very short period of time. So I was kind of keeping track of this thing, and I noticed the gray line was going right over, right over Perth. And I said, oh man, time to turn the beam. So I turned the beam to the proper heading, called CQ zone 29. Mike VK6HD comes right back to me. We work, I get the zone, I turn the antenna back north, and we continue running Europe. Amazing. RF is amazing. So we did very well on that one. I think that was one where we actually won the world. Next was Galapagos, HC8DX. Galapagos is, of course, just off the coast of South America. So North America is loud and available. Europe, we don't have to go through too much of the U.S. to get to Europe because almost everything in South America is toward the east. So as you can see, Europe's up this way, and so we don't have to go through the U.S. curtain to get there like we do in Southern California. JA's over this way. Again, we don't really have to go through too much. So we set up in San Cristobal at the home of HC8GR, Guido, who is a farmer, and he is a ham and he's a farmer, and he raises coffee and papayas. And the power to the place was just basically there was one power inlet from the generator, the main generator on the island, and it ran from one room to the other. Well, of course, if you're gonna put a bunch of kilowatt amplifiers out there, you can't have them all powered in series because the guys on the end won't have very much left. So we decided to rewire his house for him so that everything would be paralleled. Every room would have a direct line to the power input. To do that, we bought hundreds of feet of Romex, basically taped them in big spools and duct taped them to the outside of our suitcases. Now, I don't know if you could do that anymore on with TSA, but we certainly got a lot of stairs, but we got there. The other thing is we had one antenna boom that was too long for the luggage area, so we ended up putting it on they let us put it on the floor of the passenger compartment alongside the seats. Again, try that these days. We got away with a lot. So we had again, we strung beverages out wherever we could so we could hear better on the low bands, and had another good run there. When we were done, we did some touring. Unfortunately, Dick Norton and I are both prone to seasickness, so we did one of those tours and we couldn't handle the rest of them, so we missed some of the good ones. But you'd have the blue-footed boobies you see down here, these saltwater lizards. They had salt beards of salt because that's how they excreted it, and they'd walk right up to your feet and you're having breakfast out on the patio, and looking for crumbs and treats and stuff. Scary looking, but they didn't harm you. Um, but just so much unique wildlife there. It was amazing, and we had a couple of folks from Ecuador there joining us and being part of the operation. Uh, the Ecuador, of course, is a possession of, sorry, Galapagos is a possession of Ecuador. And so when you fly over to Galapagos, uh, if you're a local, you pay one rate. If you're a tourist, you pay another rate. If you live in Galapagos and are going back home, you pay almost nothing. So, but that was well worth it. We said, hey, support the industry. Let's go. Uh, One of the other interesting things that happened here was that, as I mentioned, the power to the island is run from a big central generating plant that runs on diesel. And uh, just to save fuel, they shut the power off every night, around 8 o'clock in the morning until the next morning. Well, in a 48-hour contest, that's not going to work very well. So we went and talked to the folks and see, well, how we might be able to keep the power on. He said, well, if you'll pay for the extra fuel, we'll run it for the full 48. So we did. We got how many hundreds of dollars. We coughed up the money there. And mysteriously, Friday morning, shortly after the power came on, it went off. And they kept it off until late at night. Well, so they had the money, but they didn't buy extra fuel. They just basically unpowered the island to save, and then allocated the fuel to our period. We didn't care. We got our power. Then nothing went out, and we were fine. But interesting how things work in some places. Next, from the tropics to Alaska, KL7Y. Dan Robbins was a great host. There were two big multi-operators stations up there in Alaska. Dan was in Wasilla, a place that before a certain presidential candidate ran, nobody had ever heard of. But it's basically up at the top of the Turnagain Arm from Anchorage. Uh, and he had multiple towers, amps. We set up in all the rooms of the house and did a big multi-op there. Uh, and the other one was KL7RA. But now when you're up there, propagation is very different. And I was on 40 meters, and I remember distinctly hearing one of the Caribbean stations. I think it was one of the Papatous calling CQ with no answers, and I was sitting there with a full kilowatt and a 3-element beam on 40 calling him, and he couldn't even tell I was there. He was CQing in my face. So, and I attributed it to, the fact that the noise levels in the Caribbean are so high, he simply might just not have heard me. But later on, in reading some of the some of the writings from on propagation up there, I realized that because of the magnetic field bending, uh, signals going out sometimes take an odd turn. So there really was one-way propagation, and it's the only time I've experienced it like that. Everything else I've been able to chalk up to, local signals and conditions. Uh, in a as we had a little extra time, my wife and I drove up before the contest up to Fairbanks from Anchorage. It was quite a trip. You're going past all these little churches with Russian cemeteries and so on, And it's a long trip. And we almost ran out of gas, and we realized that's not a place you want to run out of gas because there's almost no stations in between, and it's like a 400-mile trip. So we had to be watch ourselves on that. But what a beautiful place! I've been back multiple times since then for different purposes, for work, for fishing. But Dan was a wonderful host. Um, and by the way, I'll have another comment on him in a moment. Um, Next was down back to South America, and we did Brazil from the home of PY5EG, Ohms Atalano de Ohms. Many of you have probably worked him either with that call or their contest call, Zulu Whiskey 5 Bravo. Ohms had a great spot here, multiple towers. This is in Curitiba, outside Sao Paulo. And we had a great time there. And this was an interesting one because he had, of all the towers, he had one for 20 meters on each end of his property. And we happened to have both Marty Lane, OH2BH, and Jim Niger, N6TJ there, interested in 20. So they said, well, let's split it. It was a phone contest. So one of them took, 14-1 to 14, 225, and the other took 225 to 300, 350. And they each had Kenwood TS 940s, so they plugged in on opposite ends. Unfortunately, when one transmitted, the other one got kind of blanked out. It really killed the receive. So it looked like that was going to be a problem. But I had brought my TS 930, where I'd put in some Fox Tango filters in it and so on. And I said, just for giggles, let's try substituting your 940 for my 930, which I could use his 940 on 80 meters because it was just one of me. And PY5TT also had a TS 930, so he swapped with Marty Lane and get his 940. Well, plug for plug, you just unplug the 940s, put in the 930s, and now when one transmitted, the other had no problem. So just that change in model um, made the difference between being able to operate on the same band with kilowatts and not being able to operate on the same band with kilowatts. That taught me a lot about about rating and evaluating your radios, and also about the benefit of add-on filters. We again got to do some touring after this, and we went of course to Rio de Janeiro, where my wife had her purse stolen with her passport. So most of our time was spent in a embassy office trying to get a replacement passport for her. We also went into Iguazu Falls, which is kind of at the conjunction of Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. And if you ever saw the movie The Mission with Robert De Niro, and it starts with him crawling up this huge falls, that's Iguazu Falls. And it had rained pretty well, so we had lots and lots of water in there. And you can walk across the top of the falls, you can walk underneath the falls, and boy, what a sight! And then we even took a helicopter ride around the falls area. So that was just spectacular. And we also went to Manaus, which is right where the in the jungle where the Rio Negro and the Amazon come together, and you can actually see the dark water and the light water coming together and mixing. So we spent some time there. That was, huge mangrove trees and so on. That was really cool. And we were able to do a lot of this because uh, it turns out the Varig, which is a domestic carrier there in Brazil, had a special deal for a couple of $100. You could get an air pass for I think a month, and for that you could fly anywhere within the country that you wanted. So fly to Rio, fly to Manaus, fly to Iguazu, all good. The one fly in the ointment was coming back from Iguazu, I think. We ran into a thunderstorm that was just violent, and the plane was being thrown, and we were being thrown all over the place. And I was very concerned. Those of you who are pilots may have heard something called radar shadowing, and that is, if you have a weather radar in front of you, um, sometimes the precipitation is so dense that it hides what's behind it. So what it looks like is you've got all this, it looks like you have a thin spot that you can run through, but in fact, that's the eye of the thing. So, and I think that's what we did. I was afraid they were going to have to put up a memorial to 6 dead contesters, but fortunately we got through that. But boy, that was a scary one. Next, how we doing? Uh, Next is Morocco. This was again with some of the voodoo guys, um, and we were in Rabat, and we were right on the water uh, with the the Mediterranean. Basically, right across from us was Europe, so that was a slam dunk. Right across this way was North America, Japan over here. So again, a really excellent place. And of course, those of you familiar with the CQ contest will know that working contacts on a different continent are worth more than working contacts on your own continent. Well, in North Africa, almost everything else is a 3-pointer. So I think we ended up coming in second in the world on that one, but we did very, very well. The, the this was a CW contest. Some of the group had been there for phone, and in the process, they'd put up 6 towers into this field. Well, the concrete was barely dry, barely cured when we got there, and we had to put antennas up. And so I'm always one of the climbers, it turns out. So I was supposed to go and head up this 80 or 90-foot tower. So I'm climbing up there, and this little guy from the French team goes zooming past me. And I thought, how the hell did he do that? Well, it turns out he's a circus aerialist. So I can't outrun a circus aerialist on a tower, that's for sure. But we got everything up. Um, Unfortunately, I brought the plan for 160 was to run a long wire off one of these advertising Zeppelin things, the helium filled balloon, and the French guys there, who of course were, they're just across the Straits of Gibraltar from Morocco, were supposed to bring the helium, and they didn't. So we scrounged around and we found a tank of helium. We start filling the balloon and realized the tank was 3/4 empty. So we only had enough to get it partially inflated. Yeah, what a drag. So then we had to deflate it. And of course, you don't want to waste all that good helium. So we were sucking helium and talking like Mickey Mouse for a little bit. But so I just had to run a random wire up from one of the towers. It was very suboptimal, and we did not do very well on 160. But overall, very interesting trip. Again, I brought some beverage antennas, beverage transformers, and so on, and we laid them out. And unfortunately, we got out the morning before the contest, and somebody had taken all the wire. So they wanted it for scrap to sell. So we had to lay them out again and have somebody out there to watch it, make sure it didn't disappear. Now, the very first expedition I talked about was to Randy's place, KH6XX. Well, it turns out in 1992, my firm, I was a CPA, my firm wanted to transfer me to the Honolulu office. And we need to look at a place to stay. And it's going to be for, fairly long term, I think 4 years, 5 years. And so it happens that Randy had sold the place to a Japanese investor and a ham who really didn't stay there, kind of left it, unoccupied, and decided to put it up for sale about that time. So that station I showed you became my home for 4 years. So N6VI stroke KH6. And this is a ground view of what it looks like. The first tower is 15 over 8 elements on 15 over 8 elements on 15, with the top rotating. When they're in phase, they're toward the US. And then we had a 2-element 75-meter Telrex. And then we had another 8-element 15. Then we had 8 over 6 on 10. Then we had a 3-element 40, which I put up. And we had 5-element 20, which I put up. And even though you can see this pole house down here, by the time we got there, and Randy had added a whole bottom floor. And so there was a 600 square foot radio room with two position operating desks for each of the 6 bands. 8-foot desk, 8-foot desk, 8-foot desk, all the way around this place with hard line coming from the towers and power. It was a huge upgrade from what we'd seen the first time we got there. And boy, the station really played. I think it was probably at the time the loudest non-government station in the Pacific. And we made a lot of good friends there in the community. Some we still keep in touch with, and the station really played. Now KH6YY, Alex owns the place, and I had a chance to go back there about a year and a half, 2 years ago, for CQWPX phone with the late Chip Margelli and a number of other friends, and Jim Niger. So we had a great time just kind of seeing the place again and all the wonderful improvements that Alex has made to it. It's really a show place now. If you ever get over to Oahu and can get up to the North Shore, you got to see it. It's incredible. The next is Charlie 5 Zulu. That is the Gambia. Now, I've done a separate presentation on this, as I mentioned. So you can go back and look at the YouTube archives from on the RATPAC channel and find Prepare for the Worst, Overcoming Operating Challenges in the Gambia. So I'm not going to dwell on that one. And actually, we are getting close to the stopping point. So I think this is probably where we're going to call it. And the rest will be in part 2. So at this point, let me stop the screen share and let's see if people have questions.
Okay, looking for hands up.
Nothing in chat.
They're all stunned.
Wake up, wake up, wake up. Okay, well, it's been a good one. Lots of experiences there. Appreciate that. Anybody got any
One
comments?
question.
Sure, go for it.
Why with?
Sorry, Barry again?
Why would you have ever moved back from Hawaii after being in that wonderful amateur radio station?
Because if I wanted to keep my job, I had to move back. They needed me back in LA. And Hawaii is a very expensive place to live when you don't have a job.
Okay.
It is when you do have a job, but at least you can
I was
afford
going
it.
to.
I mean, back when gasoline here was $1.75, it was 5 something there. Everything was super pricey, including the real estate. But if other circumstances had occurred, I might have been able to stay there. But as it turns out, my dad had heart surgery back home, and I was able to, I was home for that, and so it worked out fine. But heck, it is a fantastic place, and if you ever get a chance, if you haven't been there and done radio, it's quite a place. WPX was a blast because you're equidistant from all those contacts in the US and all those contacts in Japan. You can keep busy as long as you want.
Nothing else in the chat, Dan. So we're good.
Yeah, looking good right now.
All right.
No questions. No hands up.
We'll save the rest for Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, I was speaking of Hawaii and good places to work radio from. Let's say political considerations aside, just geographically, what is the best place in the world for being a ham radio operator?
It kind of depends on what you want to do. If you like to build and do microwave stuff, probably central US or the Pacific or the Atlantic Northeast. If you want to do worldwide contesting, the northern tip of South America or the northern edge of Africa is the best place, just from the point structure standpoint. I've been to some beautiful places like Mauritius, lovely spot, very far from the rest of the world in terms of F-hops to get to places. So you're not going to be the loudest guy on there, but you'll be very popular because you're rare. Rarotonga, gorgeous island. And we had lots and lots of pileups from there. very popular on all modes. I couldn't pick a favorite, but again, it depends on what your particular cup of tea is, whether it's DXing, contesting,
Mhm.
experimenting, what have you.
I was thinking HF, DXing and contesting, along the lines of what you've been talking about.
Well, one possibility would be, in fact, I just hosted a fellow I met in Thailand. And he is a Brit that's assigned into Kenya, and he lives in Nairobi, and he loves it there. In fact, he's about to retire, and he's going to stay there. He wants to live there. He said the radio, there aren't many hams there, so he's always in demand. He's got good signals all over the place. I took him up with me to Visalia because he'd never been. So we flew out and I took him up from LAX. And I'll tell you, it was like being with a rock star. Every 5 feet, somebody wanted to stop and talk to him. And he knew all the call signs because he'd worked them, but most of them he hadn't done face to face. And so he just had an absolute blast. But he loves it there. And he's invited me next fall. I'm hoping we'll be able to do I don't know which mode, but hoping we can do something from Zone 37 there. And so for him, that's the place he'd most want to be. So you'll find different flavors for everybody. But the good part is there are a lot of great places, and as long as the other elements of the environment suit you, you can have an awful lot of fun.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else?
Are we going to take up a fund here so we can go on one of these?
And by the way, most of these trips were not super expensive. I mean, we never have to go to any foundations or ask for any money. It's out of our pockets. But many of my trips were done with Dick Norton, N6AA, as the lead. And Dick is really good at finding inexpensive flights and hotels and so on. And most of my flights, like, round trip from LA to Mauritius was $1,200. Jordan, I think, was 700 or 800 at the time. But we never spend a huge amount on airfare. We always find deals, and you make your schedule a little flexible, and then we bring our equipment where we can, and if there's some overages for extra antennas and luggage, we just split it among everybody. It's part of the contest cost, and it always works out. So, the cost ends up being really not much more than would be for me to take my family on a trip somewhere, per week. It works out about the same. Okay, with that, let's go ahead. I think I hear the dinner bell going. So
Hey, that's good timing.
if there are no other questions, we'll say 7-3 and see you sometime for round 2.
All right, sounds good. We'll pull the plug unless anybody's got anything else to ask the track. There, your lips are moving. What was you saying?
Thanking everybody for coming. And we'll see
Thank you,
soon.
guys. Good to see you as always.